Governor, are you prepared to take the constitutional oath?
I am.
If you place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand and repeat after me, I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
It is perhaps the most powerful leadership position in the world today.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
The person who is elected president by the people of the United States makes decisions and takes actions that affect people in far corners of the world. Neither royalty nor prime minister, the president is both head of state and head of government. It is a position of enormous power, tempered by the checks and balances of the legislative and judicial branches of government. At the close of the 20th century, the presidency of the United States is a position that has been filled by only 42 people in its history. Only a handful are legendary.
Well, I'm partial to Lincoln.
Because he worked the hardest.
Because if he didn't become president, the South and the North might have been two different continents.
Signed the Emancipation Proclamation.
Washington. Because if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't be here today.
He's the first president of the United States, fought in the Revolutionary War, leader of the country, one of the founding fathers.
Roosevelt.
He saw the country through some of the most difficult periods in our history.
And he was interested in what was happening out there in the country and the suffering of people.
I happen to like Clinton a lot. I just think that he's a president of today's generation.
I would say Truman, Woodrow Wilson.
Kennedy.
Jefferson was just, a very presidential man, always.
There's no greatest president, I don't think.
Well, I think Lincoln is clearly our greatest president, and I would put FDR and Washington in that category. Washington was a man who founded the presidency. He set its precedents. He was a man of great moral force and balanced judgment. FDR led the country successfully through the worst depression in our history and through the greatest war in our history. It's unfortunate, but many of the presidents whom we regard as great were great because of their capacity to deal with crisis, and often with military crisis.
Lincoln, Roosevelt, and George Washington, our founding leader, rise to the top of the charts because of what they provided the nation in those critical moments. They all were unusually gifted political leaders, and they knew the values of the American people, the dreams of the American people, and they summoned this country to do what needed to be done in order to solve major problems and move the country forward.
It is the purpose of the nation to build now with all possible speed.
And there are half a dozen other presidents, rated as near great, Jefferson, Jackson, Polk, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Harry Truman. One of the interesting things has been the steady rise of Eisenhower. In the first poll after Eisenhower's presidency, he came in, I think, 27th or something like that. But since then, as we discover more about the Eisenhower administration, and also if we look back on it with nostalgia, the Ozzie and Harriet theory of the 1950s, Eisenhower has steadily risen. So now he's, in many cases, has achieved the near great category. Ironically, Harry Truman, he was once asked who the 10 worst presidents were, put Eisenhower in that list.
Which presidents do we consider failures, and why?
Well, we have a few, right? Harding.
Oh, that's a tough one.
Probably Van Buren. His cabinet was plagued with people not so honest.
Well, I think the most disappointing probably would be Nixon because there was so much promise for him.
Nixon.
And reason?
Watergate.
Two that ordinarily have the dubious honor of ending up last are the hapless Ulysses Grant and the feckless Warren G. Harding. I think that's a bit unfair. I don't think either of them were bad men. Each of their administrations was tainted by considerable scandal. But I would tend to take presidents as failures who really did great harm to the country because of misjudgments and wrong ideas. And I would therefore think that Buchanan, Herbert Hoover, and Nixon would be my three candidates for Hoovers.
The League of Women Voters is pleased to welcome to the Cleveland, Ohio Convention Center Music Hall President Jimmy Carter and Governor Ronald Reagan of California, the Republican Party's candidate for the presidency. The candidates will debate questions on domestic, economic, foreign policy.
Two presidents of recent times present contrasting personalities and styles. They had little in common in terms of management style or political values. Though their administrations were back-to-back, they couldn't have been more different. How does history rate them?
Carter ordinarily comes as an average president.
I believe that although we live in the greatest nation on earth, it can be even greater. And that's what I'm going to try to do if you'll help me, okay?
Reagan is regarded by some as near great, by others as a failure.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The great difference is that some people look on Reagan as the man who won the Cold War. Others look at him as the man who ran the largest peacetime deficits in our history, who tripled the national debt during his presidency, and who led the attack on government from which we have not yet fully recovered.
For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he has done to heal our land.
Jimmy Carter brought integrity and compassion to an institution that had suffered a loss of respect after the resignation of Richard Nixon.
They say that the United States has had its day in the sun, that our nation has passed its zenith. My fellow citizens, I utterly reject that view.
Ronald Reagan gave the country a sense of self-confidence and represented United States strength in the face of communism. How did two such different men handle the day-to-day job of being president? What were the strengths and weaknesses of their respective styles of leadership? And how did they confront the unforeseen challenges of their time in office?
My own view is that Carter was a very intelligent man who didn't like politics and really didn't understand the presidency.
You dressed up for you. Don't I get any credit for it?
Reagan did understand the presidency in some way. He didn't know what was going on a large part of the time.
I remember when I announced for president in December of 1974, there was a major headline on the editorial page of the Atlanta Constitution that said, Jimmy Carter is running for what?
President Carter responded to a yearning of the American people after the Johnson and Nixon presidencies. He brought integrity and honesty, and that was a large contribution. He, however, also was a managerial sort of leader rather than a visionary leader.
I might say that our comprehensive nationwide health program that's been presented to the Congress
and sometimes seemed to lack the capacity to articulate a vision or to use the bully pulpit in a way that could rally the country around larger goals.
I asked in the very beginning, I'm not a scientist, and I said, is it worthwhile? Is it possible to look and see if there cannot be developed a defensive weapon that could actually intercept those missiles as they came out of their silos?
Ronald Reagan will go down in history, I think, as an unusual president, one who was enormously liked.
There you go again.
A very popular, affable person who knew how to use the bully pulpit. His style as a president was one that was in great contrast to President Carter.
We've set our sights on
in the sense that he was uninterested in details and tactics, but he did see the larger picture.
and yes, for strength over weakness.
Presidents must be many things to many people. Most importantly, perhaps, they must be able to communicate their vision.
Good evening. Tonight I want to have an unpleasant talk with you about
Carter, for example, seemed to regard the giving of speeches as a disagreeable task. He didn't understand that politics is in the end an educational process, and the speech is a marvelous instrument of presidential persuasion.
A recession is when your neighbor loses his job. A depression is when you lose yours.
Reagan understood the power of speech as a means of persuasion, and he understood that you had to persuade people if you're going to get anything done.
President Reagan was known as a great communicator because he could deliver a great speech on television. He had the actors training to have great poise and great presence. And he also had a sincerity that was real.
I urge you again to contact your senators and congressmen. Tell them of your support for this bipartisan proposal.
People wrote in and called into their congressmen by the thousands. And that's a very unique kind of quality to have. On the other hand, in a personal situation, Ronald Reagan was not so great at communicating.
Doing everything we can.
Doing everything we can.
Thank you, sir.
But he was good in a scripted sense.
Well, I hope that someday in the future, a lot of that Nile water that now goes into the ocean will be going down across the Sinai and the Negev desert.
Different presidents have different talents and skills. Each brings to the office a unique combination of strengths and weaknesses which contributes to their presidential management style.
President Carter has always been very much of a manager who wanted to give a large number of people as much access to him and him to them as possible. I think the Carter Oval Office was probably more accessible to more people than is normally the case.
I tell you about the special needs of farm workers, particularly migrant farm workers.
He enjoyed listening to and indeed sometimes instigating the byplay, the back and forth between and amongst members of his staff.
If you raise it, that gives it a great deal more certainty or weight as U.S. policy.
He saw that as a way to help clarify his thinking, to elicit additional information, to make sure he had thought of the questions that needed to be asked.
Well, President Reagan, of course, is well known for his delegation of authority.
He was interested in having major managers around him who handled the day-to-day responsibilities, and having a strong chief of staff and a strong staff system suited his particular temperament and leadership style.
A president's administration includes the White House staff, members of the cabinet, and various other advisors on issues such as national security, foreign affairs, and economic policy. President Reagan also consulted an informal group of longtime friends and advisors, whom he called his kitchen cabinet.
Every president has a slightly different arrangement, and it usually is a matter of their temperament and their style of leadership.
The person who manages access to the president is usually his chief of staff.
It's probably one of the most powerful positions in the United States government. Your job is to run the White House, to make the trains run on time, to be a counselor and really primary political advisor to the president, to make sure that you act as an honest broker, that all people who have something to say on any particular policy issue have an opportunity to make their case to the President of the United States.
President Reagan had some strong personalities serve him as chief of staff, and I think Reagan liked it that way. President Carter had a variety of political aides who came out of his campaign and came with him essentially from Georgia, and it seemed to most people who are observers that these aides did not have the stature of some chiefs of staff.
Several of the senior staff members, for example, were encouraged to deal directly with him on matters of concern to them. Indeed, about halfway through the term, he and we concluded that we had probably gone too far in that regard.
One can be overly protected by a senior White House staff, and I think Reagan probably was. And one can be unprotected by one staff, and Carter probably was.
Some of the notable successes of Reagan's and Carter's administrations can be attributed to their particular styles of leadership. So can their failures. Carter's greatest success is usually considered to be the Camp David peace accords.
Jimmy Carter said virtually from the first day he walked into the Oval Office that peace in the Middle East was going to be his major foreign policy priority. In the first few months in office, he met with more leaders from the Middle East than most presidents do in a term.
He deserves credit for bringing those parties together, and one of his great abilities was in one-to-one relationships, talking about integrity and personal responsibility, trying to get those leaders to work together.
Most of the times in history, when a peace treaty was signed, one nation has won, the other nation is lost. Today we've signed a peace treaty when both nations have won.
Jimmy Carter took a personal interest in bringing peace to the Middle East, and his efforts paid off. However, when American citizens were taken hostage in Iran several years later, his powers of concentration and energy were focused on obtaining their release, to the exclusion of almost everything else.
Ironically, when the Iran hostage crisis occurred, his popularity went up as people rallied around the president, hoping that he would provide leadership. But the president was stymied in terms of negotiations. We had an abortive rescue attempt that was embarrassing.
Late yesterday, I canceled a carefully planned operation which was underway in Iran. Equipment failure in the rescue helicopters made it necessary to end the mission.
The decision to launch a rescue mission for our hostages in Iran was obviously a very important one. It was a difficult one.
If they want to do something like this, to release these hostages, you must be sure that they will definitely be killed.
It was, I think, as thoroughly a debated decision as any I've ever been involved in. In the end, of course, despite all that, the operation failed.
A lot of people second-guess his efforts at the rescue and negotiations. Tough to know exactly what should have been done, but I think it hurt the overall reputation of the Carter presidency.
Perhaps looking for a leader who instilled a greater sense of security, Americans chose Ronald Reagan over Jimmy Carter in the presidential election of 1980. The Iranian hostage crisis was resolved on the very day of Reagan's inauguration. It was Jimmy Carter's final achievement, but it came too late. Ronald Reagan would face a different set of challenges and opportunities as President of the United States.
I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding.
He was very involved in trying to win the Cold War.
There's a bear in the woods. For some people, the bear is easy to see.
He was a great advocate of increasing defense budgets. He was a great advocate of being a staunch opponent of communism anywhere in the world, whether it was in Central America or in the Soviet Union.
He held certain beliefs very, very forcefully and very viscerally, certain cardinal principles.
We have inflation because the government is living too well.
He never transgressed those principles. I mean, he would just never change them.
Looking back, I think historians would give a certain amount of credit to Ronald Reagan, together with other presidents going back to Harry Truman, for taking a hard line with respect to the Soviet Union and trying to make sure that Soviet expansionism didn't occur.
The flip side of Reagan's strong stance on communism was that it led to the covert operations now known as the Iran-Contra affair.
On the advice of my attorneys, I must decline to answer.
Allowing his staffs to transfer funds that emerged from sales of arms to Iran to later go to the Contras in Nicaragua are very controversial.
I just have to believe that they're going to be found innocent because I don't think they were guilty of any law-breaking.
Laws were broken, and there was an arrogance in the White House. And Ronald Reagan himself may not have really been the architect of this, but his aides and staffs were plainly very enmeshed in this, and it was a low point in the sense that integrity, public integrity, was lacking.
Beyond the dichotomy of Democrat and Republican, Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan were fundamentally different types of leaders with different strategies and styles. For each, their personal leadership techniques were a double-edged sword.
And in many ways, the combination of a Reagan and Carter is what Americans are looking for.
I'm a big man with a big plan, and for my plan no other guy would do, 'cause I'm a big man.
Many United States citizens may have thought they'd found the perfect combination of Carter and Reagan in Bill Clinton.
This election is a clarion call for our country to face the challenges of the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the next century.
The 42nd President of the United States possessed the intelligence, energy, and compassion of Carter, while sharing the political skills and persuasive powers of Reagan.
I feel so strongly about this. All of our efforts to
President Bill Clinton is decidedly in between. He knows how to delegate on occasions. He has some strong people around him, but he also is a policy wonk who likes to talk hours and hours about policy issues and congressional issues. He's a consummate politician in the sense of loving politics. If you're going to list a number of elements that make up great or effective presidential leadership, you would have to have very high on the list that the person be an effective politician. You would have to have high on the list intellectual capability and intelligence. You would also have to have integrity, honesty, and character-related aspects that are very close to honesty and integrity.
An allegation is not the same thing as a fact.
But personal character became a contentious issue for President Clinton, as he and his cohorts were drawn into an endless round of accusations, denials, and investigations. Though nearly all presidential administrations have alleged scandals, President Clinton's administration was plagued with them from the beginning.
Well, President Clinton is a very effective politician. He has been, he's also a man of great intelligence, but he's a man that seems to be lacking in self-discipline. And he seems at times to be character challenged, if I can use that word, in terms of his personal life. But he's been one of the great politicians in the White House in the 20th century. And he has some of the abilities that Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan had of using the bully pulpit on matters of health care, of matters of trade, on matters of race relations.
Little Rock is historic ground, for surely it was here at Central High that we took another giant step closer to the idea of America. God bless the Little Rock Nine, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
Despite the criticism of his personal character, Bill Clinton was elected president in 1992 and re-elected decisively in 1996. The people of the United States clearly perceived in him a man who could lead the country.
I think on major matters of peace and race and overseas issues of democracy in Haiti and Bosnia and elsewhere, he by and large will be judged to have come down on the right side of issues.
I believe our nation has already made the difference between war and peace there.
On the domestic side, more than any other president before him, Bill Clinton used his vice president to great effect on many issues.
How to change the government so that it works much, much better and costs a whole lot less.
Perhaps the administration's most significant domestic achievement was reaching a balanced budget agreement with a Republican Congress after the record deficits of the 80s.
I think he was able to compete effectively and win in many of these negotiations with Gingrich because he was able to go to the country and make his case.
They would not even continue to talk unless we agreed right now to make deep and unconscionable cuts in Medicare and Medicaid.
Not all Clinton's efforts were successful.
The contrast to that was the health care plan that Bill and Hillary put together. It was an overly complicated plan, very difficult to sell, They were hard hit by the insurance and pharmaceutical industries. I think that their intentions were very noble. I think a lot of people would have benefited, but the politics and leadership and management of that particular issue had a lot to be desired.
You have given me an opportunity and a responsibility that comes to few people. I will do my best, and together we will build that bridge to the 21st century. Thank you.
It's always difficult before a presidency is completed to estimate exactly how a presidency will be viewed in history. There wasn't a major crisis during the period similar to the Depression or the Civil War, and great moments obviously bring out greatness in a leader. And had that problem occurred, maybe he would have displayed even greater leadership. But I think he'll be viewed as a very effective politician, as a very bright president, as a very well-meaning president, a very hard-working president. As a president who had several very good people around him, particularly helping to manage the economy. But it remains to be seen.
A place in history for any president is determined by a variety of factors: personality, political skills, and to some extent, fate. But what will we expect of presidents to come? Through what new challenges will they have to lead us?
Obviously, going through a great structural change in our society, the presidency must explore the ramifications of the movement into the computer age and try to assess some of the developments of modern science. I mean, cloning, for example, may be a big problem in the 21st century. There are a whole series of questions like that, which previously have been dealt with only in science fiction.
Can they outline bold visions of where the country ought to go that resonate with the American values? Can they unlock the best impulses of the American people? Can they summon up the American people to make some sacrifices on behalf of what will be good for the nation? Goodness knows we need leaders who can bring out the best in us. And a president, from time to time, has to call upon us to affirm the higher values and the higher purposes and the more generous impulses that this country is all about.